President Biden is currently meeting with Chinese President Xi in the San Francisco Bay Area on the sidelines of this international economic summit with Asian Pacific leaders. That high-stakes meeting, which is now in its second hour, is the first time these two leaders have met, let alone talked, in a year. And in the course of that year, relations between Washington and Beijing have come under immense strain, including the U.S. shooting down that Chinese spy balloon earlier this year and multiple close encounters between the U.S. and Chinese militaries in the South China Sea. Here's some of what the two leaders had to say at the start of this meeting.
Mr. President, we know each other for a long time. We haven't always agreed, which was not a surprise to anyone. But our meetings have always been candid, straightforward, and useful. I value our conversation because I think it's paramount that you and I understand each other clearly, leader to leader, with no misconceptions or miscommunication.
For two large countries like China and the United States, turning their back on each other is not an option. It is unrealistic for one side to remodel the other, and conflict and confrontation has unbearable consequences for both sides.
For more on what we can expect out of that meeting, I'm joined now by Monica Alba in San Francisco and Bonny Lin, director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Monica, how will the White House judge if these meetings have been successful? Are there deliverables that we expect to see?
A couple, Garrett, and the president actually put out a baseline for how he views success in this meeting yesterday. And there are a couple of areas. Probably near the top of the list would be the resumption of military-to-military communications. That's something that totally broke down after then Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan more than a year ago. And that is something that both sides have likely agreed upon at this point, that some of the close calls in recent months, when we're talking about the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the fact that these military leaders can't pick up the phone and talk to one another is a real concern. Perhaps when this was most problematic was, of course, when the U.S. shot down that Chinese spy balloon in February of this year. So reestablishing those kinds of communication channels is paramount. And you saw there from those remarks from both leaders that there could be, quote, unbearable consequences if some kind of a smaller skirmish or issue mounted to something larger in the form of any kind of military conflict. They don't want to let that get to that point. So reestablishing those kinds of military communications is a real key deliverable that they expect to have come out of this. And then there are some other more obvious areas of cooperation potentially. There could be a joint working group on addressing fentanyl, specifically the fact that these chemical companies in China produce some of the drugs that then go to Mexico, are mixed with other substances, which become fentanyl-laced other kinds of drugs and opioids that are then smuggled into the United States. That's an area where I think we can also see some kind of potential progress, but there are plenty of other very thorny, intractable issues on the agenda that there might not be real progress, but overall the U.S. will say the fact that these two leaders are sitting down face-to-face, having these conversations is a real significant moment in this diplomatic relationship that really has had a lot of issues in the last year, Garrett.
A lot of issues and a lot of behind-the-scenes maneuvering to even get to this point. Monica Alba, thank you. Bonnie, you just heard Monica outline some of the expected deliverables here, including this possible announcement on fentanyl. I was in a press conference with Chuck Schumer, who seemed to suggest that he thought that was a sort of a definite thing that was going to come out of this. But this does kind of feel like low-hanging fruit. When you don't talk for a year, the idea that you might continue talking after you talk is pretty basic, right?
That's right. So aside from fentanyl, another deliverable that we have seen, or outcome we have seen, is cooperation on climate change, particular agreement on both sides to invest more in renewable energy. I do think that, though, that neither side is going into this meeting expecting major outcomes. Part of it is that both sides want to stabilize relations as we may be moving into a relatively potentially rocky year in 2024. 2024, we are expecting the results of Taiwan's next presidential elections in January. And depending on how that election pans out to be, it could be one in which Beijing might want to, or might feel like it needs to, escalate against Taiwan. We're also expecting the U.S. presidential election in 2024 to potentially introduce more uncertainty in U.S. China relations. I think China's fully expecting that as the U.S. presidential election heats up, that President Biden, as well as Republican leaders, will potentially embrace more rhetoric that is about competition with China. And China is not going to like that at all.
China has some unsteadiness in its own government, too, right? I mean, they don't have a defense minister right now. The Chinese economy has been weaker than it has been traditionally. Talk a little bit about the position Xi finds himself in domestically coming into this meeting. What are the Chinese looking for out of it?
Sure. So I think yesterday, President Biden may have said, I don't have the exact quote, that China does face some difficulties at home, exactly like you mentioned. Economically, China is experiencing a number of challenges, including the difficulty in attracting foreign investment. We are seeing record rates of youth unemployment. At the same time, on the foreign policy side, China recognizes that some of its activities on its periphery, as well as with other countries, have led to pushback. So Xi Jinping is coming to this meeting expecting that the optics will look very good for him. I think one of the reasons why he is interested in meeting with CEOs after the meeting with President Biden is, for example, to make the pitch to U.S. corporate leaders, hey, invest in China. So hopefully he hopes to leave this meeting in a better position than he had when he came to these meetings in the United States.
You mentioned foreign affairs. Obviously, there are two wars going on right now in which Iran is kind of a major figure behind the scenes. The Chinese have some influence with Iran. Is that another area we might expect to see the president and Xi discuss, the Chinese using their influence on Tehran?
I think definitely that will be a topic that President Biden and his team will mention to the Chinese. I doubt we will see significant movement there, just because China, first of all, has been very reluctant to really step up in the Middle East, but also because I don't think the Chinese believe that they actually have that much leverage over Iran. Most of their leverage is on the economic side, and the Chinese don't want to present themselves to be similar to the United States in the Middle East in terms of using its leverage to tell Iran what to do. I think in some ways that is a little bit irresponsible of China, but that is how they view their constraints in the Middle East.
Very interesting stuff. Bonny Lin, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.